Hey there hunters, and welcome back to another Remnant 2 Dark Horizon build showcase and video. Today we're going to head into the home stretch and start talking about range damage builds. These builds can be typically broken up into three categories here in Remnant 2. You have your automatic weapons, your non-automatic weapons, and your charged weapons. For the most part, the gear in each of the categories is going to be the same, and you can just swap around the weapons with some minor tweaks here and there. So today we're actually going to talk about the automatic weapons. I don't actually plan to cover charged weapons like Monorail and Genesis, mostly because I do kind of expect those to get nerfed at some point, and also they're just not really my playstyle and I'm not really good with them, so I'm going to stick to what I know. Anyway, the automatic weapons. There's actually a lot of good choices for automatics that I wanted to talk about as we're doing our DPS checks and stuff here at the target dummy. We're going to be using a pretty similar setup here for the Plasma Cutter, the Corrupted Savior, Nightfall, and kind of Monarch on the side. Now let's discuss the pros and cons of each of these weapons. Plasma Cutter here is probably top 3 highest DPS weapon in the game for sure, maybe top 4, but it does have a lot of flaws that you have to consider. The first part is that the damage is ramping, so while it is good and consistent on the target dummy, it's nowhere near as perfect in practice when you have to dodge bosses and stop shooting, which will reset your damage ramp. Also, the Plasma Cutter's base damage is extremely low due to the fact that the damage ramps up, so it actually doesn't leech very well because that's all based upon the base weapon damage. So it's kind of hard to rely on it for leech, and you're better off just going with shield or armor stacking if you want to maintain survivability and actually expect to get hit. Plasma Cutter is still amazing for bosses that you get a lot of uptime on, like Ravager and Annihilation and Shahala, but it's not great for most other bosses, especially on boss rush where you kind of need to clear trash and maintain ammo as well. Next is the Corrupted Savior. While weaker than the Plasma Cutter, it still holds about 8 to 9k DPS over 2 to 300,000 damage. Corrupted Savior also doesn't need to activate mods, it's pretty much always at full potential, just depending on your 1000 cut mutator. So you can actually use Corrupted Savior all the time for zone clear and bosses during boss rush mode and not have to worry about getting your mods back when you're going up against your world bosses and such. It's also got outstanding reach at 20 meters by default, and with its relatively high base damage of 51, it leeches pretty well. Corrupted Savior feels excellent to use in boss rush, but you do have to be more mindful of your ammo use because you're going to burn through that really fast. But because you're not using the mod either, you can save trait points and rings as well compared to the other builds, which makes it a lot more flexible for going a tankier setup. Lastly, we have the Nightfall, and despite all the nerfs and what Reddit may tell you, Nightfall still is an amazing gun. It has literally everything going for it. You can sustain about 10k DPS over 300,000 damage, it has infinite ammo while in Dreadwalker form, which can be sustained pretty much indefinitely. It also has amazing defenses with the whole you are harder to hit bonus in Dreadwalker, and 10% leech on top, which is outstanding because Nightfall also has the highest base damage of these weapons, and so the leeches are very chunky, and even chunkier now with this bonus leech on top. You can effectively go through all of the gauntlet without ever running out of ammo if you're careful enough, and so that also leaves you with the ability to just use your sidearm only for, a mod activation like Nebula, and rely solely on Dreadwalker Nightfall to just carry you through the entire map. So after going through the gauntlet with all three of these automatic weapons, I do have a few things I wanted to note and just basically my experiences with them. First is that, dude, I got complacent after playing so many mod and skill builds. Range builds have a much harder time playing, as they can't leech anywhere near as well. Sure, shield tank builds work just as fine, but the leech just isn't there. But also, I need to redesign my defenses for range boss rush builds because relying on leech doesn't quite cut it for range builds, and I'm not Mario, I'm gonna get hit, so I still haven't learned all the new boss fights all that well. Also, bosses without easily accessible weak spots are rough on ranged builds. Now, especially for Plasma Cutter, man, that thing is horrible at leeching, and it felt awful to use on boss rush mode due to constantly having ramping issues. Every time you dodge, it resets the damage. It never felt like I was getting it where I needed to be other than on Ravager. I'm not a fan of Plasma Cutter, to be honest. Sure, it's great versus very specific bosses and where you have the time to sit there and hold the laser on them, but you can easily just swap to it on those bosses. You don't have to rely on it or stick with it. So I still don't think it feels all that great for a dedicated use gun for boss rush, so I'm going to put it in the back burner and not continue on with this one. Corrupted Savior felt great for getting through boss rush in both zone clear and bossing, and I don't really have any negatives to say about this gun while I was using it, especially now that you can actually sustain the mod charges with Insight rather than using Atonement Fold. It's just not quite the gun for me. Now, Monarch is also a very underrated option in boss rush. While the maximum DPS potential is a lot lower compared to the other automatic weapons, the tracking MO makes Monarch insanely good for bosses such as Dusa, Annihilation, and Aleptis Tora, who tend to move around a lot. And so don't discount the DPS uptime of Monarch, even though the maximum potential is a little bit lower. It's still a great gun for bossing, and if you like it, just use it. Now between Corrupted Savior and Nightfall, I did run through the gauntlet a bunch with these two, and I ended up preferring Nightfall. But I think that's more of a personal choice because you can easily swap out the same build for Corrupted Savior, or even Monarch if you want. Obviously, I'm settling into Nightfall as the extra leech and defenses make it feel so much comfier than the latter weapons. You can breeze through the gauntlet without issue, and the DPS is still really good on this gun. So we're going to move forward with Nightfall, but obviously you can change around some of the trinkets to work with pretty much any of the automatic weapons, and I'll point those out as we get to them. Now regarding the rest of the build, obviously we're going to be using HUGS, Hunter and Gunslinger. It's the best pair for range setups of course, though charged weapons do like Invader these days, and to be honest, Invader is a fine option as a secondary for the extra defense of Void Cloak, but for the purpose of this video, we're just going to be using HUGS. For the Hunter skill, you can use Hunter's Mark for wall hacks, which is pretty helpful for zone clear during boss rush, or you can use Hunter's Focus for boss damage. Either way is fine, pick your poison. Gunslinger is pretty much exclusively going to be using Bladestorm for the extra fire rate and turning Nightfall into an automatic weapon when we fall out of Dreadwalker. Gunslinger is very useful thanks to the extra reload speed it has for other automatic weapons, but we don't necessarily need it for a Nightfall, so we're not getting the full use out of it. But other automatic weapons are going to be burning through their magazines so fast that the extra reload speed is incredibly beneficial to your DPS. But of course, like I said, you can still trade out Gunslinger for Invader, Challenge, or even Warden, depending on if you want to do different forms of defense, such as Invader being avoidance, Challenger being more armor and bulk, and Warden having shields. I think the only thing that's really set in stone is that you're going to be running Hunter. The weapons, as we've been talking about, are kind of all up in the air, to be honest. As I said, I'm going to be running this setup with Nightfall because it's just comfy and the infinite ammo really helps a lot in boss rush clearing. I'm running Momentum as the mutator here for the extra crit and crit damage, 20% is pretty fat. Nightfall can't really sustain 1000 cuts well, and we don't need the reload speed on it anyway. Your handgun can be whatever you want really. I was using the SMG with corrosive rounds and fetid wounds for trash clear for a while, but Nebula works just as well, and it can sustain corrosion a bit better than corrosive rounds. This slot, kinda up to you though. Supportive mods, heals, whatever you want, just go for it. You're most likely going to be using your long gun most of the time anyway, so just make sure you have something you can just fire and forget about. I ended up sticking with Nebula because Swarm and Feedback help trash clear as well as fuel more mod power back into Dreadwalker through Feedback, but you wouldn't need that for something like Corrupted Savior, but you probably would for Plasma Cutter. Your melee weapon here doesn't matter all that much. I just stick to my old trusty World's Edge with Shocker to deal with groups of small fry enemies, which also saves my butt in the Prima Generator boss fight. Moving on to the trinkets, you're going to need to shuffle around some things depending on your weapon, but we'll cover that. So I'm going to start with the Gunslinger Charm for the neck, as 15% fire rate is very strong. And we're going to be using Light Extract to gain haste at the start of boss fights, so we don't 100% need to run something like Nightweaver's Grudge or Anastasia's Ring to get the haste. You can also still run the Polished Whetstone if you have Bleed or Affliction available, like on your handgun, because the crit and crit damage is still very strong, but there are a lot of bosses that you're going to run into that are going to be either immune to bleed or transition and remove dots, so that's kind of rather annoying. The reload speed on the Gunslinger Charm also doesn't help us too much with Dreadwalker, as we're not actually going to be reloading this thing very often, but again, it's something you're going to want to use if you're going to plan on using Corrupted Savior or Plasma Cutter. For the rings, we have infinite damage for fire rate because we just can grab haste from items now, so we don't really want to run Anastasia. Zynia's Malice for weak spot damage, however you can swap that to Burden the Gambler on bosses without weak spots, such as Kayula. We also have the Leaking Gemstone to help sustain our Dreadwalker mod for much longer, and you're also going to want that for Plasma Cutter. If you're running Corrupted Savior though, you're going to want to swap to something else since you don't need to sustain a mod. I recommend Braided Thorns for more crit. The last ring here is kind of a choice for sure. Since we're running automatic weapons with high crit and high rate of fire, we can run Devour Loop here to fish for crits to reset our Bulletstorm. While dedicating this ring slot, which has a 15% damage reduction penalty to sustain, potentially, that 20% fire rate bonus from Bulletstorm, it's probably not the best use of our survivability, but honestly Bulletstorm keeps our Nightfall automatic when the mod falls off, so we don't stop firing, which is very good for our DPS, our mod generation, and making sure we don't stop shooting because we'd have to let go of click and click again. There's not too much wiggle room on this build here, unfortunately. You got like maybe one ring sight you can play with, but just know that if you're using Plasma Cutter, you don't need to use any sort of heat management trinkets. Leaking Gemstone should suffice to keep your mod active, and Plasma Cutter doesn't need any heat items to dump its entire clip while the mod is active, so don't worry about those. Now for the Prism, pretty standard range prism, to be honest. Sharpshooter is going to be a no-brainer for our legendary fragment. It's 75% range damage with no downside. It's absolutely insane. The other single fragments are going to be crit damage, ranged crit, fire rate, and range damage, as well as our fusions being munitions, meta, gunfighter, and I like longevity from mod and skill duration. With that as a choice, you could easily take out longevity to run something like Hulk to get more life and stamina, or you can get sniper and use the last fragment slot for whatever you want, like skill cooldown. Do whatever you want. You obviously also don't need the legendary fragment to enable anything on this build, it's just for more damage, and you're more than welcome to get several other legendary fragments, such as Jack of all trades, brutality, the crit wall on light armor, I forget what it's called, prime time, trader, or even hyperactive. Consumable note, we're going to be using bark skin to get a bit more of our defenses, but honestly any concoction's fine. We're also going to be using light extract, jet fuel, and fairy needles rather often, so keep those on your hotbar. As you notice, I'm in medium armor, as I'm going to be spending most of my time in Dreadwalker and probably not dodging or using much stamina anyway, so it's not much of a reason for me to go to light armor. Might as well mitigate a slightly bigger hit if needed, but that's more of a dealer's choice. Go light or even heavy armor if you want. In medium armor, I'm sitting about 50% damage reduction, which is still better than my brutality builds, but it's still a little scary to get hit. So on bosses I'm not too familiar with, mainly the new Narude guys, it can still get a little dicey, but we do have that Dreadwalker though to leech us back up. Going heavy armor also should be totally fine, as you can just sidestep and strafe with Dreadwalker 80% of the time. Just don't get hit back to back. But anyway, that's kind of going to be the whole automatics builds. It's rather simple, and I can't really stress enough on how good fire rate is right now. I think a lot of people are still going for the whole crit stacking thing. And sure, crit's good and always will be good, but try and get as much fire rate as you can. It's insane. Both Nightfall and Corrupted are pretty smooth at boss rush clearing, while Plasma Cutter is pretty much just for bosses only. So make sure you're good with the sidearm if you're going to be running Plasma Cutter, or just swap to that on a boss. I think automatic weapons right now are in an incredibly good spot, just behind Genesis and Monorail, and again, despite what everyone thinks, Nightfall is still an S tier weapon for sure. But yeah, that's basically going to be all for me for now. I got one more video where I want to talk about 2 different shotgun setups, but hopefully I have that out tomorrow. No promises though. But yeah, thank you all for watching, and good luck out there, hunters.